Right. Welcome to round 5 of Australs 2022. On the affirmative, we have Malaya 1, and on the negative, we have ANU 2. The motion before the House is that we support the widespread use of soulbound tokens. Without any further ado, I'd like to invite the first affirmative to start the round.
Hello, everyone. Am I visible and audible? All right,
Yep.
That's great. My timer. Right here. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Our personal information is going further and further away from our grasps and into the hands of private, capitalistic, selfish corporations and organizations that hope to blindside everyday people to utilize their data and make profit out of it. I think it's time to put data back into the hands of the people and give people the decision as to what they want to share, who gets access, and who can see what I live like. Onto what the case of affirmative is going to look like in today's debate. Firstly, 2 points to our 2 points of framing, ultimately to like 4 arguments in my speech. But on framing then, first, it's important to understand that information and data is the new currency. Data is becoming so important in this day and age, especially when MNCs and big corporations sought after it like dogs a bone. Businesses then collect consumer data and use it to power like better customer experience and to come up with targeted marketing strategies, but they also then can sell data for revenue. As technologies increase and our ability to capture and analyze data grows increasingly advanced, it is corporations that have this ability to collect and use this data much better, but it takes away our ability as people as we grow so desensitized to how data is currently being traded and sold and collected, right? On to like the specific token that we're talking about, I'm just going to call it an SBT. It's slightly nuanced in the sense that based on the information that we get from the info slide, these tokens can't be traded and sold, which they're intrinsically unique to the person in which owns this particular token. But it still has information of this particular individuals, which can still be valuable and we can prove why it'll be valuable and much safer inside. Onto our model then, firstly, who are these souls? Souls, we think, can be anyone who oversee this particular individual. It can be your schools, your universities, your companies, the government, your hospitals, and things like that. Anyone in which who is willingly and with consent obtaining the right to give out this particular token. But what are these types of tokens then? The info slide says traits, achievements, and other stuff, but I think we can expand this debate to include personal records, like your medical records, your education background, your financial information, and things like that that can be valuable to you. How does the world look like in our side? Understand that the motion says widespread use, which means the data in these tokens can only be collected or accessed if the owner allows it. But I think individuals would then be able to use it on any form or for any particular use, like applying for a job or even creating a social media profile. And this is because I think that the fiat that we have is to model it in a way that these tokens will be compartmentalized to things like healthcare, education, achievement, and social media. So an individual can share the information that's in this particular token, but in a compartmentalized manner. I also think the third thing that I want to fiat here is on people's psyche. The fact that it's widespread means that people are more aware about its usage. People are probably going to utilize this particular token even more. And I think governments and institutes also incorporate the usage of these tokens when and where necessary. Onto the principle then on ownership of data. Given the framing that I've introduced, I think it's fair to understand that companies value data a lot. They access it without going through cookies in your web browser. They collect data as your signing terms and conditions form, which you don't have expert knowledge to understand or even the fucking energy to read through like 16 pages of terms and conditions. They sell and share data with other companies without your consent. All this is to get more information of their customer base and their consumer base to come up with targeted marketing campaigns, which then people will fall into and be exploited. Why do people then enjoy increased ownership in our world? I think firstly, it visualizes the data of individuals for them. A lot of times the desensitization is factored by the desensitization towards data ownership, and why people in status quo probably don't care as much is directly related to how much information of ourselves that we know exists. The fact that I don't know how much information that I have shared online or that companies have of me means that I'm probably going to be more unaware or probably more ignorant of how much is it in the grasp of companies in the first place. But second, companies will now just be unable to access your private and sacred data without you first consenting to them and in the first place and agreeing to share. Because now that you can see the data that you are sharing through this particular tokens in terms of your healthcare records or your achievements or whatever, means that you're probably going to be more wary with how companies are using this data and who you're giving this data to. But thirdly, it's also a compartmentalization of this data by via our model, right? Companies in status quo now have an excuse to say, but that's not enough data, so we need more data from you, is the fact that our data has been just mushed together in a big blob of uncertainty that we don't have control over. I think it's much better that we can compartmentalize this data and people can specifically know what is it that they're sharing, who is it that they're sharing to. Conclusion is, the reason why this principle is so important is because there's currently no recourse whatsoever in status quo. Yeah, we call people and we call like CEOs and corporations to court and we make them testify for how much data that they've taken, but there's absolutely no recourse because they can just get away with it with their dream team of lawyers or get away with it with the way that they use their language people don't understand. I think this is when we are left behind in terms of how much ability that companies currently have in status quo. This gives back the decision to the people. Onto the practical analysis then of our case. Firstly, on minorities, it's important to understand, I don't think this even needs to be stated, how minorities currently suffer and struggle in status quo in terms of a lack of opportunity and access. This first gives them a degree of validity when their organization or institution can give them a token that says, this person is a good communicator. This person has worked with me for such and such project. Negative, but now you can see the minorities. You can specifically want to discriminate them. Number one, information in this token cannot just be falsified, and tokens can't be given by souls in bad faith, which means this information needs verified and certified through some way or another. But secondly, it curbs information through the fact that the current reason why these corporations and people have the ability to discriminate minorities is because they can just say, that's not enough information for me to hire this person. I don't know what this particular person is like. But when you have specified and verified information of a particular person you're hiring, you're more likely want to hire them and you're less to discriminate them because all the information is there for you to see. Then you might say that you can just get a recommendation letter. But those can be falsified too, right? There's a lot of data that individuals can craft themselves and which companies can then use as a reason to discriminate other minorities who probably didn't falsify this data. This is verified information that minorities can value and they can be valued by other people who probably they want to be hired by or probably want to work with. I would argue that this is a priori good. But secondly, in terms of uniformity, the fact that a lot of minorities are denied access to medical care, they lose out on privilege they deserve simply on the basis of stereotypes and the way people perceive them. I think now I would argue that there's more uniformity in information, so companies cannot just deny access. Healthcare professionals cannot just say this is a minority, they are unlikely to have insurance. I don't want to give them a treatment that they so deserve. I think that becomes better in our world. But secondly, in terms of transparency, it's important to understand this day and age where data is shared everywhere universally. I think more questionable people like scammers and hackers are more able to fish for your data through third-party sites that collect and sell your data. But then I would argue that in our world, they are going to be unlikely to do so because firstly, you can't just collect information like I've already said before, but also when dealing with a business that is fishy, individuals are likely want to check their tokens to begin with to make sure there's no funny business going around, to make sure that these are not questionable individuals that I'm dealing with in when it comes to business and when it comes to purchasing. And these are important recourse that we have on the hands of people where if we can spot out individuals or businesses or organizations that might be scammers or might be hackers, that is when we are able to take increased we can get increased recourse in our world in terms of how we charge these people and how we get people back their money. I think that's increased transparency. But also in terms of voting, is the future of transparency when we talk about bureaucracies, especially because now we can specifically assign one person, one vote through their SBTs. We won't get claims of Donald Trump making that it was a fraudulent election and they faked the votes, especially when we can get such a strong such a strong framework to protect the importance of having a clean election and to also, get information from people in how they are voting and things like that. It just gives us the ability to poll our audiences or to poll our citizens much better. I would argue that's an a priori good. Judge, if you care about ownership of data, if you care about people finally having an ability to decide what goes to companies and what they want to keep secret and private, then I think you should go with side affirmative.
Right. Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the first negative speaker.
Sorry, we just had a couple of minor interruptions in that speech because of internet. I was just wondering if that's on our end specifically or if...
I was able to hear the entire speech.
Awesome. It wasn't very long. It was like a couple seconds, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but let me know if it freezes up on our end.
Yeah, let me know if there's like disconnection at any point. Like, let me know through the chat or something so we can kind of stop and redo the speech if
Awesome.
need be. Yeah.
Okay, cool. No, thanks. All right, well, I can assume I can be heard. All right. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think when the systems that exist already allow you to access the majority of your identity documents incredibly easy, I can call my university if I want to ask for what my degree is or my transcript. I think the impact they get here is incredibly unclear. And what this means, this likely applies to the subjective traits that people have. And that is hugely skewed against minorities because that is when you are assigned a token by your employer to say that you were dishonest because they had some sort of prejudice against you, when your customer reviews are incredibly biased against you because they perceive you as a particular gender or race. Obviously, that was far, far worse. And I think this characterization is far more likely. And even if there were any sort of impacts regarding this documentation, we will show you how this is actually probably just going to use a vast amount of resources that don't make it helpful at all. Okay, start with some characterization. Then I'll talk about it two worlds in terms of how this applies to subjective traits and then how it applies to identity documents. Let's start with a few pieces of characterization. Firstly, I think in terms of how this is likely to be used for your traits, that is based on a set of impressions that people get of you, largely probably first impressions, and that is something that cannot be easily removed. Note that is important because that means that one negative token tarnish your record probably forever. The second case this is likely to be used is in terms of identity documents. We would note there is already a set of mechanisms that exist in order to access these identity documents that are not particularly difficult. We'd also note that there are already a set of mechanisms that prevent identity theft of these. For example, multi-factor authentication. Also, the fact that this information is kept in multiple different sources. Obviously, if you hack one center of government that contains your medical records, it is unlikely that they'd be also able to access your tax information because that is kept in a separate place. Okay, the third thing here is that this system, given its widespread use, is likely to evolve to capture increasingly large amounts of info, including stuff not specified by the info slide. There are structural reasons for that, including just that nations increasingly want to collect more data on their citizens. Note that in Australia, for example, we've integrated a bunch of different services under MyGov, so your health, your tax, your welfare payments, and Centrelink is all one record. This is a trend that is likely to exist here as well. And fourthly, we'd note, even if you are skeptical about this sort of system, and note this responds to their idea about being able to consent to this information, that because of that a large amount of people are using it, probably the systems that you interact with are using it because it is more convenient for them to use it, potentially more convenient for them, means that there is likely to be a lot of pressure on you to actually go and start using that, even if you are skeptical. For example, if you need your uni transcript and it has become widespread that unis just use this token, then you would have to do that in order to get a job if you had to show your degree, for example. So more people are likely to be involved in this over time. Okay, why do we think that this allocation of traits is going to be incredibly poor, particularly for subjective traits? I think there are a couple of mechanisms for it. Firstly, the blockchain. Firstly, this blockchain is just incredibly confusing and hard to use. I think firstly, we'd note here that you actually have to require a huge amount of resources in order to be able to implement this policy. Note that, for example, the blockchain has used the equivalent amount of energy that all of the Netherlands has used in 1 year. Obviously, that is a huge amount of resources. Also, it requires a huge amount of understanding for you to actually implement that sort of thing. Note that tech and finance are incredibly prone to hype, and that makes it incredibly difficult for just ordinary people to understand it. And there are a bunch of just complicated factors about Bitcoin mining as well. What that means for this case, for this debate, is that the people who can actually add these sorts of transactions are the people with the most power. And that means it's probably likely that the government runs these sorts of, is able to assign these traits, maybe large corporations, are the ones who have the most power and resources in order to be able to implement them. What that probably means is rather than me setting this system up themselves to assign tokens for your degree, you probably have them ask the government to do it because they have that greater amount of resources. I think this also, again, responds to their consent mechanisms here, because it means that also just the fact that it is so complex, the fact that it is so complicated probably just shows that if there is a bunch of terms and conditions associated with this, it's just harder to understand. Therefore, you're likely to consent without knowing like necessarily what you are consenting to. Okay, why is that a particularly bad thing? I think that if the governments have this sort of information or ability to assign those terms, I think that governments inherently probably have a bunch of perverse incentives. Note in the worst case, that probably looks like authoritarian governments, obviously like Xi Jinping or Modi or Netanyahu have massive incentives to like create in and out groups based on this data. Obviously, that is an incredibly bad thing in an authoritarian regime. But also note that this occurs in non-authoritarian contexts as well. For example, obviously governments have a bunch of incentives to know like which political parties you might be more likely, and obviously that has been assigned based on personality previously, as we saw in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and that is a result of like governments seeing this information as particularly valuable. I think also, it is just they probably want to do that a lot because these are easy statistics that allow government to actually find like who gets welfare, where should we allocate funding for certain schools, and that obviously means that is something they'd want to do. But I think even if the government was an absolutely perfect actor, this is still absolutely terrible for the assigning of subjective traits. That is because it is impossible for the government to know exactly who you are as an individual, and that means they rely on certain people telling them what those traits might look like. For example, and what that means is essentially that like one bad review from an employer or a bad manager that you had that you stood up for yourself when you were being abused is enough to tarnish that record forever. That is obviously an incredibly bad thing. And also important to note here is this is always going to disproportionately affect people who are suffering under existing power structures. That means you're always going to get worse reviews, for example, if you are a woman, if you're a person of color, if you are gay, if you are trans. Obviously, that is in the best case scenario for them, where this is like the government is an absolutely perfect actor. These systems of power are still in place. That means these people still get far worse traits here. Okay, why therefore are people likely to, like the people in charge of like giving you jobs and so on, probably like listen to this? Four main reasons for that. Firstly, because given the topic says this is widespread, it would probably just become custom and normalized in society, and therefore they would just think this data is like real. The second thing is that employers are generally risk averse. When lots of people apply for your jobs, they want to give it to the one who has like the least negative traits, for example. Note that might also be true for like relationships. So like if you're on a dating, it's probably likely to have a similar trend. But the third thing, and probably quite important here, is that given the fact that blockchains and so on are so shrouded in this sort of tech and finance jargon, that people generally don't understand them very well means it probably they have a massive perception of this being a very secure system and quite an objective system, which means they are far less likely to challenge that sort of data that exists on. And I think also, fourthly, there's probably just more of a focus on negative tokens. That's why you find it harder to get jobs. The impact of this is incredibly important because I think this inherently skews bad for people from minorities, which has an incredible impact on their ability to access things like jobs and their ability to access things like welfare. For example, if a government is able to like use these records to analyze like who are good welfare recipients, not only use that to assign it in incredibly pernicious ways, but also can be use that to weaponize against like just those policies generally, like again, only giving like make that like reduce funding and so on. Obviously, this deletes their minority point entirely, given that those power structures still exist, and that this happens if the government is a perfect actor. I think secondly, this is important because private corporations now deny you jobs, but also you can just find it harder to interact with society generally. Like this thing probably applies to like your Uber rating, for example. Like you can't just acquire services because you are seen to be a bad customer. So it's just harder to interact with society generally. Again, note that skews particularly towards minorities. Thirdly, this probably just affects your interactions with other people. That is to say that if you can't like meet friends on social media apps because they see like these negative tokens, or like on dating apps, for example, which means it's far harder to challenge those stereotypes that come from you from that people have about minorities when they can't interact in a holistic way. Okay, that deals with the most likely case, but let's assume their best case here, which is where this is used for identity documents. And I think this is this would basically be completely irrelevant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, as I've already outlined in my introduction, in the status quo you can access these fairly easily. But secondly, identity theft is just not a huge problem generally, because like it requires a massive amount of political capital to do. But thirdly, we actually flip this because your information is currently stored in multiple discrete sources, which means you can't hack one thing to get all that info. Obviously, that changes here. But also, most scams happen at the human level, technological. So this isn't fixing anything at all. I think at worst, at best here, it takes a huge amount of resources and energy. It achieves literally nothing, and it probably skews worse for minorities on those subjective traits. Incredibly to oppose.
Right. Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the second affirmative.
Yeah, I can be seen and heard, right?
Yep.
Okay. Panel, if I'm able to illustrate to you at the end of this speech that discrimination to a large extent is symmetrical, but even worse under the world of negative, where they can't highlight or make accountability mechanisms to solve it. But more importantly, the speaker before me completely framed out the monumental benefits that we can preserve as a result of SBT. Expediting processes of healthcare, for instance, expediting processes of getting a loan that's so important for instant gratification to the most vulnerable, reliable, expediting process of, for example, uniforming education systems so that people can't falsify this information, it's more credibility. There's so much of benefits that we provided towards SBT, and they just said, at best, this is marginal and result to discrimination. I'm going to solve this at the first exchange. I'm going to explain why discrimination to a large extent is worse under their world, and all our benefits exclusive to SBT, which they can't claim, which is important as a weighing mechanism in this debate. With that in mind, two questions I'm going to answer in this speech. Firstly, do we improve the livelihood of the most vulnerable as well as the rest of society? And secondly, how the uniformity of SBTs can expedite processes of systems that safeguard the interests of society much better. Before that, one clarification that's really important in debate, because I don't think negative team was predicated on this clarification. Negative team operates on the assumption that now people can all see your data, and therefore it's easier for the most horrible actors to espouse on this data and cause further perpetration of violence on you, hostility on you, and discriminate against you. The first thing that we really know about SBT is that people can have the ability to compartmentalize different information in multiple wallets. That means you don't explicitly display your information. This is encrypted, and oftentimes you can consent towards granting that information towards other forms of corporations that exist. This is significantly important because it is not the case individuals can completely find out every single thing about you unless you grant it. But more importantly, it's not confusing to you because oftentimes individuals can have different compartmentalization of different data, and it's very easy for you to be able to see. The point here is you can hide certain points of data that you do not want to share. You can't delete it completely from your particular, but disclosing that information is something that's likely if you feel that you're uncomfortable with it. This premise is important in order for the debate to operate in fair game towards affirmative team. Done with the clarification, first question, how do you improve the livelihood of the most vulnerable as well as the rest of society? Responses to them will be integrated. The first claim they make is blockchain is difficult and hard to use because it's incredibly confusing. First response to this is, Judge, even the poorest individuals have access to digital wallets. Maybe it's the case that they don't have access due to by way of not having subsidies or not having way of some level of infrastructure given to them, but it's only that. It's not that they do not have knowledge. What's the evidence to that? Look at Venezuela with hyperinflation and a high rate of poverty. The individuals who are poor there, the beggars, are using online wallets to beg, and people are transferring money online in order for them to go on to their regular lives. This similar system is also operated in multiple developing countries where they use online wallets to be able to trade even in the most lowest common denominator. This claim already explains why, to a large degree, the current age and time and the changing landscape of modern day technology means that even the most poorest individuals have some access to banking or digital wallets, even if they're poor. If that's not the case, this motion calls for supporting the widespread use of this technology, which means we have some fiat to explain. We can make sure this technology or SBT is accessible to a large degree of population, and we can establish some level of infrastructure that trickles down. And because technology proliferate downwards, if you're able to increase the support and increase the widespread, the cost of it also significantly reduces, and we can have subsidies to have based on that. But the first response shows that poor people can also access this. Number two, we're confusing. It's only confusing, Judge, if it's the case that you're bombarded with so much information and you can't digest what this information means. You can't synthesize what this information. The differentiating factor with SBT is categorization and compartmentalization. That is, we have specific compartments of your identity information. That means your identity number, for example, identification number, or your personal information like your history, your medical history, for instance. But it's also different compartments for your education history, different compartments for its cost. That way, it's much easier than I guess, any other systems that exist. Because you absent of the systems, it's even more confusing to people because you don't know what's happening. So their first argument, hard, confusing, difficult to use, really is non-contentious, especially since there's a changing landscape of people accessing this as well. But second argument, on the idea of discrimination, and it's a lot about harmful actors that are going to clamp down on you. The first response, which they missed out from first affirmative, is that the requirement for you to assess a value by way of the soul has to be one that's certified or validated. Meaning, if you're a racist professor, you can't just make an arbitrary racist statement to say this person or class doesn't focus so much, not so attentive, not the best communicator as a result of racist, ambiguous statements, but rather now you have to actually have documentation, certification with regards to the values that you assign. What this means is that there's much better, greater accountability measures to make sure the assignment of the values is something that is real and legit. It's far worse under the world of negative when people operate on preconceived biases or preconceived sentiments that exist. This all looks like healthcare industry, for example, stereotyping a poor person to think they don't have medical insurances. I'm just going to go prioritize a richer person in the emergency department in a public hospital. This also looks like racist educational systems that assign random values towards minority states, and they don't have to justify it because there's no requirement or certification or validation. Because all the ultimatum is back on them as teachers. If a needs to verify it, they just give a recommendation letter. So it can be a racist person validating his own particular sentiments that are racist to begin with. At least there's an external party run by block technology that can confirm it. But more importantly, I don't understand their sentiment of like things like, now if you're requesting an Uber, people will know you have bad scores, so they won't get your Uber. Isn't that a score? If you have bad scores, the driver is most probably going to reject it anyway. Or they say stuff like, if you're gay or trans, the authoritarian state can now clamp down on you. Why would you be openly gay or trans in a context of a state where it's illegal? The alternative is, if you're gay or trans in those circumstances, you go to jail. I don't know what's the differentiating factor in terms of the scale of impact with why you want to put their identity that's illegal in authoritarian states. But at least the difference in our world is we don't let corporations that engage in a practice of selling the data to harm the most vulnerable minds in our world. What does this look like? If you're in Ireland and you're a mother that wants to take, a pregnant lady that wants to access abortion, you're scared because it's legal in those circumstances. And when companies share data, it's easy for individuals to find out and put you behind bars. Similar to being gay in Saudi Arabia. At least now the onus is given back to individuals. The log of companies that are profit incentive that sell data that's so private and intrinsic to us is now given back to individuals. To the very least, we have better accountability measures and with better information which can consent before we grant this information. The argument is there. Second argument, how the uniformity of SBTs can expedite processes of systems that safeguard the interest of society best. This is where, to a large extent, I will deal with the so many benefits that we can get. The only is you don't truly consent because you will feel pressured as a result of this. That's inevitable. Technology, going to school, every single thing that you're pursuing in that has a tangible good to it is inevitably socially engineered to all of us. If you're able to show you that the benefits outweigh that particular harm, we also prove to some extent there is consent because you know where your information is going towards and it's given back to you. So now it's better to apply for loans because you're able to bypass the bureaucracies of banks that have absolutely no control and loans that are predatory, like Lehman Brothers in 2008. They're so technocratic. Much better healthcare system because you bypass the regulations that say you don't have insurance, so you get it much faster. We handle scammers and online much better. We have much better transparency in voting. All of this means we can expedite systems that is far greater than otherwise would be delayed and would hurt the most vulnerable. They don't have enough money. They cut healthcare. More people die out in the world negative as a result of SBT. We make it much better. Proud to affirm.
Right, thank you very much for that fine speech. Just a reminder that we do not take any notes after 8 minutes and 15 seconds mark. With that said, I want to now invite the second negative.
Just confirming that I'm audible.
Yep.
Awesome. As always, like if I'm gonna like drop out, just somebody let me know. The first question I'll ask is who actually has access to this data, because opposition asserts that it is only individuals with no explanation how this functions. Three mechanisms to how other people get access to this data. Firstly, if, for example, you're applying for a job or you're applying for anything like you do under the status quo, you probably have to give data to the corporation like you do under the status quo. The way corporations take data on, for example, where you grew up is because one of the questions is, where do you live? Or what country were you born in these things? So that means innately, if you apply for the services that opposition wants to explain, corporations are going to get their hands on the data. The second thing is that probably they are likely to keep a record of who they necessarily assign certain blocks to. So if, for example, a group assigns, they said that this individual person has like this membership to a university, they probably keep a record locally as to who has that, so they have some sort of record as to who necessarily has it. That means that the groups who assign this data necessarily also have access to their data. But finally, we give a set of mechanisms as to why in states where, for example, governmental systems are authoritarian or likely have large amounts of control, that necessarily they are likely to be ones who owns this data, or they're the ones who are going to be able to access it. They're the ones who maintain the blockchain system and therefore likely access it. This explains that it is not just one person gets this data, holds onto it forever, and can choose whenever they want to release it to the information. Some sets of people do need this data eventually, which means that some people do eventually get access to their data. Two impacts that clashes. Firstly, on discrimination. Secondly, on data. Firstly, on discrimination. Their claim as to why discrimination is unlikely to happen comes in like a couple of responses. Their first is verification. They say that our claim, though, is that those who necessarily verify are the ones in power. And this is where they misunderstand the point that we say as to who can necessarily access this, and explaining it requires large amounts of political capital, because we explain the ones who need to maintain the blockchain system are the ones who have large amounts of power. So the ones who assign blocks, for example, on the end blockchain are the ones who have the most power to do these things. For example, it might be easy for you to access this blockchain, but innately to put it on, you need to have a record as to who on every single block. That's how, for example, with Bitcoin. But you also need to be able to constantly verify separate transactions. That also happens with Bitcoin. And that's where all news material that goes unresponded to comes in. The fact that these require large amounts of energy input, you need to understand how these computers work, necessarily means the people in power are the ones who most likely assign these things, and therefore they have the ones who have access to allocations. Therefore, this verified point that they say, clearly then that the people who are likely to assign them are the ones with the most amount of power in society, which kills that. The only other claim here is that you can like certify, you can get certification. What certification is there if you are dishonest? What are you supposed to do? Provide records of this lie was said at this specific point in time. I would argue it works in the very same way as, for example, reference. The fact that this person says it, and because they are big and powerful and they're your employer, they're probably the ones who have the most idea under the status quo. It is unclear what certification they can have, but because we explain the people who are most able are the ones who are the most in power, that therefore means that that certification is null. The second thing they say is that you are going to specify good things against minorities. That is completely contingent on necessarily you specifying, for example, this minority individual was particularly good, or they weren't dishonest, they were honest or trustworthy or whatever. But we explain a set of mechanisms that inherently mean because those in the highest echelon of society are likely to assign it, they are most likely to have discriminatory opinions or towards these minority groups. And therefore, the assignment of these things are likely to be poor. But also, just the fact that even if not all the assignments are poor, just think about how it plays into. Even if, for example, you have one dishonest thing and you are from a minority background, an employer probably looks at that and say, well, that buys into my preconceived conception that these minority groups are bad. Even though I have a bunch of things saying honest, one person said they were dishonest once, it was probably likely that that was the one that I ought to believe. So even if you believe that very few amounts of these things are likely to be negative, it is more likely that people listen to them. Their fine claim is that you can't use referees because referees can be falsified. I don't know, man. Just call up the referees, call up the organization. No explanation here as to why referees can be falsified other than asserted. And no explanation why under the status quo people don't believe referees. Most jobs you apply for ask for referees. I think that's an intuition pump you can have. If these could be falsified, unclear why you ask for them under the status quo. Their next claim is then therefore that minorities are now given stuff or like they're denied stuff under the status quo. Firstly, that is clearly contingent on necessarily them proving that the assignment traits are going to be good towards the minorities. We explain why that assignment is likely to be bad. But here's how we actually flip it. We explain under the status quo, you're more able to call out these mechanisms. For example, insurance company isn't given effective treatment to minority groups when you have that information available. When, for example, you look at the participant list and see that very few of them come from minority background. On their side, you are more able to wash that by saying that, hey, look, these people were just dishonest. These people just probably lied on their form because of like the racist backing behind that, which therefore means it's far easier for these groups to deny access towards these minority individuals. It's far harder for you to criticize something that is seen as objective. And that comes into all the mechanisms we get at first that is unresponded to as to why these traits are necessarily going to be seen. The impacts of this are damning. The opposition only thing that they do to mitigate is you can hide yourself if you're like, for example, come out as an LGBTQ individual. Firstly, we explain the traits are often ones like, for example, dishonesty. That means that government services are likely to be dependent on whether or not you're honest. So, for example, it's far easier for you to say, okay, we'll only give welfare for the ones who are honest, so you don't have to deal with the narrative that like all people on welfare spend their money on like drugs or cigarettes. But also, what happens if you come out and then decide that you don't want to? What happens if, for example, you put a piece of information and you now can't change it because it's permanently there? The issue with opposition side is any one individual of the thousands of people you can interact in your life can mar you, can permanently have this record on yourself. So as long as you believe that some sets of the people that you interact with aren't going to have good interactions with you, that puts a burden on you and that puts a harm on you for eternity that is never removed. And finally, we explain the impacts of this comes when, for example, you're applying for a job and they ask, what are your character traits? Give us all that information. This comes in, for example, like in Uber ratings, for example, when they ask, okay, give us your character traits so we understand that. Opposition's claim is you can just deny them. You deny them, the job denies you entering. That's what happens on the status quo, where you anyway provide the job information to them. And if you don't provide that information, they deny you from accessing that job. That is what is going to happen on their side. That is why discrimination is most important. But even if you believe all their claim data and, for example, why this is very good on expediting processes, I genuinely don't care, because some people cannot access these government services. I do not care if some people can access these services like slightly fast. It takes instead of 1 day, 2 days for you, for example, to verify your identity. Truly trivial benefits. Let's talk about then on their data claim and respond to all of them. Their first claim is you can restrict data gets it. Firstly, what data do these companies take? We say the most data that, for example, Facebook takes from you is metadata, data that you generate on that site. For example, how long you spend on certain pages, what things you like. That's all generated by Facebook, not added to the blockchain. It's unclear why they aren't able to take that data. And that's the data that probably holds the most information about you. I would know this is the stuff that Cambridge Analytica stole, not, for example, where people grew up or what education they had. Secondly, a lot of this data is widely available. On LinkedIn, I can see who people can see, for example, where my education was. Thirdly, ask who currently holds the data and how they access it, because under the SEO, it's unclear how, for example, people can access data on your medical records unless they explicitly ask governmental systems for them to give you that data. On our side, it's probably far more protected. Fourthly, insofar as we expend this as a large amount of political capital, you can probably just regulate this stuff out. But largely, their mechanism for prevention isn't true, because under the status quo, people give up data because they don't read terms and conditions. They just type whatever they want into a website and then send it through. Under their side, that exact thing has happened. No explanation as to why people aren't likely just do the same thing, where they just type in, oh, you can have access to all this source of data, and then like just send it through, because that's what happens on the status quo. Because if you believe the information they steal is, for example, the stuff you put inside a text box, that is information you obviously know you're giving to them. So that necessarily means that people are able to access this data. Even if you don't buy our discrimination claim, we still also have the negative externality that just requires a whole lot of resources, a whole lot of energy, probably contributed in climate change, guys. I don't know, pretty bad. The only other claim is that this is easy to compartmentalize. It's also very easy to compartmentalize, for example, what data I'm giving out, because I know it. I know what data of mine is education. I know what data is, for example, medical. It's unclear why having it in like little folders is any better than how I classified in my own mind. Opposition never responds to discrimination stuff, but also the data stuff is truly trivial. I'm so proud to oppose.
Right, thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the third affirmative speaker.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yep.
All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Three parts to my speech. The first, which side offers more control over personal data? The second, which side protects people from discrimination via information? And the last, I'm going to analyze their worst case scenario, assuming that all of the harms apply, and I'll weigh that out compared to our benefits. All right, the first, which side offers more control over personal data? I just want to clarify how this model works, because negative team asserts that we are confusing in our model, or at least unclear, but I really don't know how we were unclear when we told you specifically that firstly, the organizations in which can grant you a token would be organizations like schools, universities, companies, the government, etc. We've given you reasons to suggest why a widespread use of this would mean there's a robust system in which people can access the system and then collect tokens based on whatever they do in their life. There's also explain as to how you would have different wallets when it comes to different things that you're applying for, different purchases that you'd like to complete, different jobs in which you apply for, where you can compartmentalize your data then and visualize whatever data you have at hand. What are the contentions then from affirmative? Oh, I just want to make it very clear. It's kind of like a LinkedIn profile, but I guess you can make a few LinkedIn profiles for different purposes and then control the information that is going to whichever purpose necessary. What then has negative told you? They've told you firstly that this concept, or at least the idea that conceptualizing or controlling your data is not that important because we already do this in status quo. But for that to apply, a lot of their process as to how companies are predatory in nature when it comes to gathering information in status quo can't apply as well, right? Because if you understand it, then you would obviously have a way in which you can regulate the way in which companies use data. I don't think this is true in reality. But also secondly, I would argue that this is a visual confirmation of the information that you have, because assuming as a rational person, you're unable to collect, or at least at that point in time when you are registering for a new website or when you're purchasing something, it is difficult for you to conceptualize all the data that you have at hand, given that individuals have different priorities in their life. So I'd argue that just conceptualizing that is quite beneficial to a lot of individuals, especially when that information is one that is supposed to be validated and verified, is only the point at which you are able to receive an SBT in the first place, right? Negative then contends that metadata is still collected. So there's, I guess the harm is supposed to be somewhat symmetrical, right? But I'll argue firstly, there's no reason anymore as to way in which companies are supposed to collect your data, because given that your information now is supposed to be in the form of tokens within the system, I'd argue that there's more, at least more of an ability for you to control data, your metadata being collected by companies. But also secondly, we already see the advent of controlling or at least taking back some of your information, right? Like how iPhone users have to give permission for companies to track your data while using the app. And a lot of times if individuals already opt out of that. So given that metadata is kind of like a problem on both sides of the house, and this is me taking our worst case scenario, I'd argue that even then, at least when it comes to the company explicitly asks you for information, and given that you don't have a count of whatever information you have that a company would find profitable and might use against you, I'd argue that this conceptualization is still a good thing, right? Able to compartmentalize or at least control when which company gets your information when it comes to where you're born, your identification number, etc. These are all things in which you gives you more control over the data you have at hand. Second part of my speech, which side protects people from discrimination based on information? Note that this is like the biggest contention coming from negative, that information will be used to discriminate against minorities, etc. I think they kind of like rely on three premises, so I'll break down these three premises. The first premise they rely on is that party companies or third-party organizations are able to access data that you don't necessarily have. But argue that this is only through consent, right? Which is what my first two speakers have clarified. Their response to this is say that consent is not really there because of the pressure to use, but also secondly, like it isn't really, like people don't really understand the system, so they can't consent in the first place. Two responses. The first is quite symmetrical. The pressure to use any system or the pressure to give up as much information as possible already exists on the side of negative. But also secondly, I'd argue that you have at least more of an informed choice. So even if you're forced to give up your information, at least that comes with you knowing what information you're giving and then being able to determine whether this information is one that would be used against you or not by these particular companies. The second premise that they rely on is that you can't really alter an SBT, but I argue just the same as how a LinkedIn profile works. If you get an extremely bad review from a racist lecturer that paints you as an individual that isn't fit for employment, I'd argue that firstly, that is incredibly difficult to do, given that you need proof of that particular negative trait. I'd argue that oftentimes racism because it is so ambiguous in nature, it is extremely difficult to validate and authenticate to make it a token in the first place. But also secondly, I argue that you can alter your SBT because of the fact that you can create different wallets for different trades. The information that you can omit, you feel that information is one that is likely to be used to discriminate against you. The third premise they rely upon is generally in authoritarian states. I'd argue that this is in a minority of instances. This doesn't really apply to a majority of people that live in democracies that don't always want to kill, the members of the LGBTQ plus community, or always want to discriminate against you. But also secondly, if this debate is set in authoritarian states, this is kind of like where it's worse off for negative as well, right? Because they already have this information to begin with. In China, you're already dealing with the social credit ranking system in the first place. There's no change there. So if this debate is to be one that is fairer and one that operates middle ground, I'd argue that this at least gives you like some way in which you can collect your data back from the government, or at least ensure that you have control over who is able to disseminate your data. Let's compare it to side negative. Side negative is dealing in a world in which companies already have a large amount of data and they freely trade your data. I think the blockchain technology that we have on our side already prevents that to a very large extent. It's an exclusive benefit that we get outside the house. But also secondly, a lot of this information has to be validated. A lot of the metadata that negative claims that would still exist outside the house are just traits based on the things that you use, but they're not personal, or at least information that is related to you as your identity, or neither is it one that is particularly validated or authenticated. So because I argue that the information that you have control over and outside the house is protected to a larger extent, and this is the greater, or at least the more important information, because it is directly related to your traits, the things that you've done in your life, and how this would make you like a functioning member of society. Their mechanism for calling out companies and why things are already okay in status quo is then call out companies. I think there's no basis firstly to calling out companies because you literally don't know what information they have and what information they're trading. But also secondly, I think there's no basis to this because the argument that's always been used in status quo is that you consented to this when you agreed to like the terms and conditions of the platform. I think integrating the system, or at least forcing companies to engage with this, means that there's less ability for them to access as much information, especially information that they don't need, but at least it just ensures that people have a conceptualization of what they have and what their value is, right? Let's take the worst case of side of negative, that people can see this information and discriminate against you. I think firstly, corporations are unlikely to do this because people want some level of trust in the system. So if there's already some record of companies abusing the system, people just wouldn't opt in. But also secondly, I think we also see a precedence of corporations changing, like what I've mentioned earlier. Thirdly, the mechanism in which the system works is one that necessarily protects against this through blockchain technology. And lastly, taking their accountability mechanism, I think it's easier on outside the house when you have like verifiable grounds in which you can call out companies because you know that they've taken this information from you, as compared to team negative where you have no conceptualization of data, you don't know where it's flowing to. Weigh this out with our additional benefits. You at least have some level of anonymity, or at least some level of ease when it comes to registering for systems. We ensure that at least minorities can access the validation that they desperately need in status quo. Very proud to affirm.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now, to summarize the constructive portion of this debate, I'd like to invite the third negative.
Thank you. Just give me one moment to organize my papers.
Yep, no worries.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. By the end of this speech, I will dismantle their 3 paths to victory: expediency, less discrimination, and control of your data. And at that point, Negative will win, not just because I demonstrate that the affirmatives model is ineffective, but because of all the harms that we have listed. Note, panel, that where they have fallen down in being comparative in their responses to us is appreciating that simply because there is more data, that gives more room to companies or governments to manipulate individuals. Because it is the case that the more you know about someone, the more you can blame other factors other than their race for when they didn't get it. That is the power that the affirmative hands to the very worst companies, the very worst governments. Even if there are good companies or are good governments, the marginal benefits that they try to claim do outweigh these harms. Two things in this debate. Firstly, do you achieve better ownership of data, and is that even important? And secondly, just like a smattering of harms and benefits that the opposition has. So in this first theme, the opposition broadly has two arguments. Firstly, they tell us that people themselves will take more ownership of their data, and they give us three reasons. The first is that people see how much data there actually is about them contained in their wallet, that means that they won't want to share it. A few responses. The first thing to say is that actually the sheer volume of data that you probably can in your wallet is actually going to make people switch off, because people would probably have the perception of wow, there's literally millions of data points in here. How would anyone ever analyze this? It probably is irrelevant. And they would probably happily send that data anyway. The second response here to note is that most people probably won't even know how to check their data. We'll come back to that later. And the third thing is that the reality is most people just don't care. We've known about issues of companies selling data for literally a decade and a half, and people are just not voted enough to fix it, because at the end of the day, it does not impact their lives. If anything, it helps by getting more targeted sales on the internet. The second argument that they make is that, now because you compartmentalize your data in specific wallets and then you then share those specific wallets with companies, that is better. The most important thing to note here, though, is that anyone who wants your data will obviously just construct a specific wallet or preset compartmentalization category that they want from you. For instance, now, when you are looking through the Google terms and conditions, they will say, for your fees, apply this preset condition to your wallet and send us that package of data. That means you don't have any extra control, because it is likely that any of the key things Google wants, like your search history, they're going to bury in layers of millions of layers of other things that they want from you. People do not have the time to scrutinize that. They do not scrutinize terms and conditions now. They would not do so in the future. The final argument they make about ownership, though, is one to say that, people do have knowledge, and they give some examples of Venezuelan beggars. Obviously, this is not the vast majority of people, and I would posit that most people, but particularly elderly individuals, for whom technology is rapidly expanding beyond what they could ever have imagined, do not comprehend the way things work. That is why, for example, Apple runs sessions about how to use your iPhone in Apple stores. That is an example that demonstrates most people do not understand the technology that they use. Note that this material here note that all of affirmatives material merely shows that individuals have an option to control their data, but they do not actually demonstrate that individuals have the capacity, i.e. the knowledge, or the willingness to control the data. That brings me to their second argument, which is that broadly, people can choose how to share their data in their world. One major response here, and that is simply that no, they're not, because certain sites will not let you use them unless you agree to their terms and conditions and agree to share their data. So even if they are more knowledgeable about their data, they are literally still coerced. For example, you cannot use Google unless you sign up to their terms and conditions. You cannot browse a website unless you allow their cookies, right? Note, importantly though, Soul tokens do not change this. You would need to pass separate laws in order to regulate the way that Google collects data, and so the affirmative does not fix this. But note, importantly, people do need to use these services. Firstly, there is a revealed preference for using these services. The stocks of all technology companies continue to increase. That shows that people are not actually offended that much by the data collection. Secondly, you obviously need access to the internet and websites for university or work. Thirdly, there is a huge social pressure. That is to say, people will be like, oh, why do you refuse to share your data? What are you hiding? Why does it matter if Google knows your search history, right? And that is another pressure that operates on people. Finally, as I mentioned before, the average person just does not care. Scandals like Cambridge Analytica or Facebook being in the US Senate make the news cycle for a day, then they disappear, because at the end of the day, people are more preoccupied with living and surviving. The only response here is that, but at least people are more informed. As I just explained, that does not change the coercive element of this of the way the data is collection. At the end of this, affirmative offers no extra way to control your data, and even if they did, it is not an important impact. Next, I want to move to expediency, because the main, like, they try to sell you a bunch of benefits like hair, loans, and voting becoming more expedient. 3 responses. Firstly, many of these things cannot be expedited. For example, with healthcare, there is little room to improve on the current system. For instance, you show your like healthcare card, they take a note of it, then you go see a doctor, and later on they fill out all the paperwork. Note that even in countries that do not have such an efficient system, it is better and easier to just like borrow a system, for example, that we have in Australia and apply it to a developing nation, rather than to invest and use this like blockchain technology. And that's for the reasons we give. Firstly, blockchain uses a large amount of energy, which many countries probably could not sustain, and also contributes to global warming. But secondly, the systems we have currently are much more secure because they spread your data over multiple different servers that cannot be hacked all at once. The second response here a second response here is that expediting is just often not that useful. When has everybody ever been upset because they got a loan one day later? But most importantly, if you know a process takes a lot of time, for example, you're applying for a visa into the States and you come from a country that doesn't have a free movement agreement, obviously you just apply for the visa earlier on. There is a very limited benefit that can be gained here, and to the extent that it can be gained, it is only for the most privileged people who are going to get loans or are going to be able to travel in any case. This is not the most important impact in the debate. Finally, people are just skeptical of online things and of speed. Consider the fact that like people always worry about China hacking and controlling elections and Trump fear-mongering about online voting. Even if you could expedite these things, people just like wouldn't want you to. Okay. Finally, they talk about how it is easier to call out bias. A few responses here. First of all, obviously the power structures that are going to verify your like whatever credits thing, whatever you're talking about, are probably still racist in an instance where racism exists, and they would not care about your protests. The second thing to note is that many of these things are difficult to validate, and presumably an individual would only like question or query or ask to be validated if they receive a negative comment. Like if someone commented on your token, he's the best person I've ever worked with, no one would want to validate that, right? But only people would query things like, oh, he was dishonest. And that means that the querying process is going to be extremely hard because you're trying to find a needle in a stack of needles. The third thing to note, though, is that actually this automatically gives companies more ability to defend themselves against being called racist. That is to say, in the affirmative world, a company can know we weren't racist, your token just said you were dishonest, right? And because they have more data about you, they can make that claim. In the status quo, they cannot do this. And also on your token, it is likely even if you have 15 positive reviews but 1 negative review, a company would fixate on that. Finally, I want to weigh against our harms because we tell you that in despotic regimes, they will improve their ability to track and control you. Their only response is like, oh, but you're already in such a bad scenario, it doesn't matter. That is complete garbage. The scenario can always get worse. And to flip their example of a gay person in Saudi Arabia, imagine the government was tracking where you bought drinks and was spending and that you were always with a certain group of people that then discovered one of those people was gay. They would obviously then suspect you of being gay, for instance, right? Increased sense, bad. Even in good regimes, governments can still manipulate this, for example, by analyzing electoral profiles or by justifying certain bad policies with the data. Those are the harms that we'd be proud to oppose.
Right, thank you very much for that fine speech. Now on to the reply portion of this debate. I'd like to first invite the negative reply.
Confirming I'm audible.
Yep, you're audible.
Oh, thanks so much. Firstly, on discrimination, I'm going to break down the claim that we give a negative and the responses we give an affirmative because they are woeful. First, we explained that the people who assign this data are likely to be very powerful because you need to have large amounts of technology and information to access this blockchain system. But they also concede, they say that the people who likely assign it are employers, are the government, are private organizations. This was uncontested. The next claim under this was that you are likely to get a series of bad references from these individuals because of the fact that they are more likely to buy into racist notions or conservative notions that go against minority groups. That was proven at Niamh. Their only response is a verification system. We give 3 responses. Firstly, the most powerful are the ones who are the most trustworthy, so it is unclear as to how this verification necessary works or why people listen to it. Secondly, according to their own case, you can't verify referees. How are you supposed to verify this? How are you supposed to verify even employers as you were dishonest? Unclear, using their own mechanism. But finally, what is the mechanism of verification? How do you verify a subjective thing of somebody being dishonest? You have to list every single lie that they've told your company. They never provide a mechanism as to how this verification works, only assert the word verification. The final claim that we make, or like the third claim under this, is that companies or organizations are able to access this data. They never contend with the central claim, which is that when you, for example, apply for a job, when you apply for government services, when you apply for a loan, they ask for that data because they need to assign it to you. I guess the implicit response that comes out a third affirmative, the latest point in the debate, is you don't have to necessarily give this data over. Firstly, we explained that these people, like under the status quo, often force you to give that data over. The companies won't hire you if you don't tell them your name or where you live or what your postcode is. Likely to happen under this side. They never explain as to why this necessarily means that you can restrict that access to the data. But secondly, we explained because the groups of people who likely have access to this data aren't just necessarily you. And their mechanism is missing as to why you are the only one who has access to this data other than assertions. But we explained a group of people who probably could get access to this data. Governments, or the people who necessarily assign the data, probably have a copy as to who they have. Or, for example, companies who hire you have a copy of that data, and they keep that data because when they ask it for you and then they get that information from you, they keep it from you so they can do things like send you products and like etc., that sort of stuff, which means that you can probably just ask these organizations about data on individual. It is not as constrained as they want to claim. The impacts of this, the only response therefore they have is that authoritarian regimes are symmetric, which is both the most extreme example that we give, but obviously it is easier for you to discriminate against a minority group if you have access to the information that allows you to rile up tensions against this group. If instead you don't have to say, for example, this race is bad because question mark, but instead can say, look at this data, look at how bad their reviews are, this race is bad. But we explain also a set of other mechanisms impacts to this. Firstly, other regimes, for example, democratic regimes can still do things like allocate resources based on how trustworthy you are, whether or not you're like, for example, a good person, and whether or not you're likely to get welfare. No response to this. I just think that's good allocation of resources that these people might do. But finally, on corporations, we actually flip the claim and explain that firstly, these corporations are likely to deny you access because they directly get that data from you. But secondly, we explain that it's far harder for you to call corporations out on racism. They're now able to more effectively hide themselves behind a veneer of we were just using this data, we're not being racist, which necessarily means people have reduced access to loans, they have reduced access to welfare, they have reduced access to a set of benefits that allow them to live in society. Their only benefit is that you might be able to show racism with verification, but they never explain how verification works for this side. So this dies. This is the most important issue, because even if you explain on their side, you have slightly more control over your data. This is about completely denying the most fundamental aspects of the human condition to individuals. The only mechanism on data they give is compartmentalization, which is just you can sort things out, but the response at second is that you sort things out every way. I have a folder in my for like education, a folder in my mind for medical stuff, etc. They can never deal with discrimination. That one thing on data is truly laughable. I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Finally, I'd like to invite the affirmative reply.
Sorry, can you just give me 1 minute and I'll run to the toilet really quickly?
Yeah, sure. Don't worry.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I'm back.
Still audible.
Okay, perfect. This reply speech is simple. I'm going to give you 3 technical flaws of negative team that already makes them lose this debate. And I'm going to give you 3 other reasons on why we hammer it home. Firstly, technical flaws. Their first flaw, Judge, is the lack of a comparative in this debate. Note how all their arguments stem from the premise that when we have SBTs, there's more data, companies can steal it because we're giving them more alternatives. Let's just evaluate this premise for a bit. If their mechanism or their premise is that more data equates to more avenues of theft and therefore so much of discrimination, then why isn't this happening in the status quo? Status quo is insane amount of data. A person produces or creates about 2.5 quintillion bytes of data, and all within the locks of tech giants, MNCs, the entire hospitality industry, governments, banks. This data already exists to a large degree. I don't understand why when we compartmentalize data by way of a software, suddenly the harms are really great. They also don't explain the weighing of all of our benefits as to why this is something that we cannot afford or it's not exclusive to our side. No weighing in terms of why our benefits are not important in this debate. I don't know why this is something that's like this is a huge flaw on their side. The second flaw on their side is they centered their entire on authoritarian regimes. Note how we already were very clear to explain it's worse on their side, because if you operate on authoritarian regimes, it's probably a clampdown is going to be worse. That China operates on social credit system, for instance. That's why this debate probably occurs in more democratic or fairer countries. And the difference here is you decide what you want to share and the ownership of data is on you. It's unlikely that it's the case that you want to put that you're gay and now you cannot remove it, because the option for you firstly to hide is still there. But number two, at least in our world, there's more onus of you to know what exactly data that you're consenting to and who actually you're giving, which corporation at least you're giving to. So the private information, your ability to have autonomy of your data is something we preserve. The third flaw, and this is so important, they're pushing an insane technical burden on us. They're saying, how do you verify? And this verification is subjective. And if one person says it's dishonest, now this person dishonest remark as an assignment of a value. Judge, I think we have fiat to assume that it's not our burden to prove this insane comprehensive mechanism of how it works, but just to respond, I think just because there's a requirement for you to fact check and validate, that means you have to at least review across multiple researchers and a diversity of resources. Meaning, unlike a reference letter or recommendation letter that is up to you and your own thought process on what you think about a person, probably when you have to verify it, you have to check with other lecturers, for instance, other friends to peer review. Those are mechanisms we don't have to prove, but it already shows there's some accountability measures that they weren't charitable at all. 3 areas in which we win. First, on the principle of data ownership. They explain it's really difficult. You don't consent to it. Older people exist. I will use third negative response to help our case. They said Apple had some seminar to teach older people. We can have all of that. Seminars to teach people, increase subsidies to make sure the technology reaches people. The bottom line is we prove that there's a changing landscape, modern day technology, and even the poor can't understand. But even the worst case, they don't. Technology proliferate downwards, the cost goes lower, and they'll understand it later on because it's really simple and everything's compartmentalized and you can see. The difference in our world is at least giving the owners back towards you. The fact that private information like you being gay or every single business decision and every single thing that you do, every single thing now is owned by you. You can consent to who you want to give the ownership to. So important because we preserve the right of privacy and consent, at least it's an informed decision on our world. And it's also important to note that even if you have access under their world, it's blockchain technology. Everything is anonymized. So I'm unclear why the benefits of countries clamping down can even happen if they don't know what this anonymity looks like. Second area in terms of minorities. They just said calling out corporations is going to be harder. We explain why calling out is difficult in both cases, but we explain that racism substeps all of these processes. So even if you have a process of a recommendation letter, for instance, the subconscious bias and the power of lecturers can always substep this and always racist in the their world, at least in outside as accountability measures. But finally, in terms of weighing, we give you insane benefits in terms of transparency of voting, transparency of at least going down on scammers, for instance, transparency and expedience of hospitals and loans. What this gives back is the ability for individuals to actually have access towards their amenities that is pertaining towards their own much faster. We preserve these benefits. This weighs out over any of the external harms that we talked about because it actually saves lives under our world. For those reasons, incredibly proud to affirm.
Right. Thank you very much for that fine speech, and thank you for the round. Right. thank you both teams for the debate. I'll just go in straight to the decision and justify the decision. So we thought this was a relatively clear result, and we had a consensus decision, and the team that took the debate on a consensus is the side negative. We would add that this was a difficult debate to judge, mostly because mostly because of two things. Firstly, because the setup was, I think, quite messy, and that impacted the entire debate because there was a lot of claims and assertions going on about what this is all about and what this is not about. And secondly, a lot of arguments were made, but there was not a sufficient amount of weighing going on in both teams, which made a lot of arguments very difficult to weigh at certain points in the debate. So moving on to the justification, I'm going to talk about three things in this OA. Firstly, I'm going to examine the principle, so ownership of information. Secondly, I'm going to talk about minorities and which side, I guess, provides them with a better situation. And thirdly, on access to services, regarding expediency and, well, access to services in the first place. But before that, I just want to clarify what SBTs are all about and kind of clarify what happened in the debate and what ended up the characterization that we believed in at the end. The first thing I want to start with is that there were claims that sounds not right or not correct, factually speaking. And I'll kind of point that out through this OA, but that did not impact the outcome of this debate. And the main reason for that is because both teams kind of agreed on a particular characterization that was arguably a factual. So I'm not going to insert myself and change the debate, but I'll just kind of clarify what happened there and what ended up being the characterization. The first thing that the affirmative side claims in the debate is that there is a degree of verification process, which means that you would only get credible sources of information, credible feedback, because necessarily all information goes into and through a third party who kind of has an incentive to, who kind of has the capacity to choose which ones are credible. I think there are two main problems with this claim. Firstly, I don't think it was ever explained from the affirmative how this verification process works. And I recognize that the reply speech, you did mention that it was unfair for the affirmative to kind of claim all the technological reasons as to why this could work. But that's not really the problem. The problem is more like you don't really talk about the incentives behind this actor that goes through this verification process and why they are likely to have good faith. In fact, I think the opposition side were able to challenge this by making the claim that people that are likely to be able to verify this information are likely to be those with power who oftentimes do not have good incentives as the affirmative characterized in the debate. So they're more likely, if anything, to, I guess, prioritize information that does more harm to minorities compared to, I guess, the affirmative's characterization. So that's the main reason as to why I think, well, there was a consensus in the debate that verification is possible, but I don't think it worked in favor of the affirmative in the debate. Secondly, I think the affirmative also kind of claimed that you can hide data or you can delete data in some instances as well. I think this was rebutted or responded to by the negative by the claim that you can't necessarily delete data because this is blockchain. I think this is a fair point to make. It's unclear how you could have done that, technologically speaking. So I'm kind of willing to buy the negative claim that you can't really meddle with what goes into your token as an individual. So the conclusion of all of that is that I do think teams agreed there was an actor that controls this, probably a state or a big corporation otherwise. But those actors would have their own incentive in kind of regulating information that goes in and that gets attached to these tokens. And that's going to be relevant, I guess, when I talk about authoritarian states or different actors later on in this OA. But I don't think it had such a huge impact on the debate. But yeah, that's like the clarification of the setup of the debate. I don't think like verification is something that happens in reality though, because the point of these tokens is that they are decentralized and individuals would verify these things through proof of work, which is what happens with Bitcoin, for example. So yeah, I don't think this was necessarily speaking of the reality. But anyways, that's irrelevant. First question on the principle. So the affirmative here makes a number of claims. Firstly, that corporations in the status quo breach data privacy without consent. I think this was a point that is true, and it certainly wasn't challenged by the negative side. But the main problem that I have with this claim is that it was unclear why these incentives disappear under your world. Because you make the claim that corporations do it, but you don't really explain why the introduction of these tokens would deal with the existing incentives of corporations to gather data. And I think this was a point that was inherent to the affirmative's constructive, and also pointed out by the third negative speaker when they explain how corporations would still have an incentive to collect data to their advantage. Obviously, they don't want to rely on individuals' good faith giving their own data to corporations. Corporations still want things like marketing data, things that like private data, for example, that allows them to advertise their goods more effectively. I don't think that was dealt with from the side of affirmative. So I agree that corporations do this right now. I don't understand why that changes under your world. Secondly, I think your claim is that you make it visible what data are collected in the status quo, and that means individuals are able to make better decisions, or I guess be more aware of the problems changing corporations and so on. Firstly, I think there was very little analysis on how realizing how much of data is collected from you leads to a change in society or change in the structure that perpetuates data collection and data breach. It was unclear how individuals, for example, are able to change corporations, for example, and this is something that I think remained questionable throughout the affirmative's case. But secondly, and I think this is where the negative side flips this entire point on the principle, thereby giving this clash to the negative side. I think the negative side were able to prove that control over data becomes far worse under the side of the affirmative. And this is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think they were able to explain that people, even if they had access to information or data that is collected of you, they don't necessarily, and they tend not to have the capacity to choose, for example, what part of their data they want to disclose or how to regulate these things in the first place. And I don't think this was dealt with by the side affirmative. So it was questionable, even if people knew that data are being collected, they had the capacity to do something about it. Secondly, the negative side makes the claim that individuals, even if they can, for example, compartmentalize data, which is the affirmative setup, and I buy that, they can choose information based on compartmentalization that individuals have the capacity to make use of. That is because the negative side were able to show that corporations would, for example, now have an incentive to rely on these tokens as a mechanism to give them more information on employees and how what their personality looks like, for example, to kind of evaluate their competence as an employee. And that means because it becomes a precondition for people to apply to jobs, for example, people are likely to be pressured into giving out their information to corporations. And they cannot really choose what information to disclose and what information not to disclose, because corporations could obviously be like, these are sets of data we want, and individuals would necessarily have to give away that part of data. And obviously people don't have control over that, which means that the opposition side were successful in proving that because corporations or other institutions would start relying on this token as a mechanism to collect data, it makes it far worse for individuals because they are now forced to give away information that is not just, for example, what websites you see, which is the status quo, but something that goes beyond it. So what is the feedback that you get from your peers? What have you done in the past? All of those things that the affirmative side claims is something that should remain personal to an individual. I think the negative were able to prove that becomes breached on a far greater scale than it is in the status quo. And I think that means that the negative side is successful in flipping the point about the principle of ownership over data in the first place. And I think this is really important in the round, not just because the affirmative side claims that this is a principal right that an individual should have, therefore insinuating its importance, but also because a lot of affirmative claims on, for example, okay, so I think I was explaining that the principal clash was important because it kind of impacts the affirmative's mechanisms that proved or that was part of your argument on how you get better treatment for minorities and stuff like that, which I will get onto later on. Yeah, so the final response that I think the affirmative had to this principal clash is that, why doesn't this happen now? I think the simple answer to that is that because there is no means of doing so in the status quo, because obviously, this token is different in that individuals have access to like a collection of all data, which now they will be forced to give away to corporations. Corporations don't have the mechanism of doing that in the status quo because you don't have the token. So I think that was kind of like a challenge that didn't really take into account what was unique to this motion. And it was kind of like a relatively random claim, I think, that wasn't sufficiently explained, unfortunately. So that's on the principal clash. Secondly, briefly on minorities, I think this was slightly won by the negative, but not necessarily by a huge margin. So there are two main things that I want to resolve here. Firstly, I think there was a clash on between the affirmatives and negatives claims on the types of feedback you get and the impression of corporations. So the affirmatives claim is that you get true positive reviews, which adds to minorities' competence, perceived competence, that increases the chance of getting employed, and so on. And your claim was that it is better than the comparative, where stereotypes already exist and minorities are likely to be disprivileged. The negatives pushback to this is that no, negative feedbacks are more likely because minorities obviously receive bad treatment in society and the perception surrounding them are more likely to be bad. And also, it is likely that even if you get very few negative responses, corporations would pick up on that because of the nature of them being risk averse. I think this was slightly won by the negative, but not necessarily, because I don't think there was a lot of explanation on why corporations choosing to put more weight on negative feedback was necessarily worse than the stereotypes that existed. So maybe it becomes a little bit worse because corporations now kind of have a confirmation that they are bad people versus a stereotype, but I don't really understand what the scale of difference is here. Secondly, I think the negative side also made the claim that it's now easier to justify discrimination because you now have a feedback. I think this was true, but I don't think it was explained why the lack of a means to justify discrimination was so problematic for corporations, i.e., why in the absence of the means to justify this, corporations would not do it. I think that required an explanation of how corporations care so much about things like reputation, which is not necessarily a claim that is mechanized from the side to negative. So at the end of this, I believe that the negative side is correct in pointing out that it becomes worse compared to the status quo, but I don't believe that the margin is substantial for the reason that there is the comparative of stereotypes that the affirmative sets up, and there's very little engagement or comparison made in reference to that. So yeah, that's minorities clash. Finally, on access to services, the first thing I want to note over here is that I think it is important to recognize that things like official document is something that remains symmetric on either side of the house. So these are things like your ability, whether or not you have voted already, your official medical certificate, your passport, your ID, something like that. I think the negative is fair in pointing out that that is likely to exist on either side of the house. So the question in this debate is, do you want to kind of put all of that together? And does it make it more expedient for you to have a token that kind of puts all of those information in one basket? And that's the affirmative's claim. It is the claim that you get more expediency in terms of providing services. But I think the problem with this is that you don't really explain what these things look like in real life. So for example, you talk about hospitals, you talk about loans and how the process gets more efficient, but you have very little characterization on what kinds of information impact hospitals' decisions, what kinds of information you need to facilitate the process of giving out loans. And I think that was not necessarily proven by the affirmative, especially in relation to the status quo, which is the comparative. So it was unclear to what extent you improve the expediency of these services provided to individuals under your world. The comparative that Neg stood for is a world where there is less access to services in the first place, which I think was mitigated by the affirmative when you claim that these technologies are likely to disseminate and become accessible over time. And I don't think there's a strong pushback from the negative in terms of access. Their additional mechanism to prove this from the negative is that there's an additional incentive for governments to prevent things like welfare because they can see your history of being a gambler, for example, and that means there's more weight put on the fault of these individuals as opposed to structural reasons that made them poor. for instance. But the problem with this is also that there is very little mechanization, because whilst you claim that there is one additional reason for governments, or one additional weapon that governments are able to use to prevent welfare to poor individuals, you never really proved how impactful that is in terms of, I guess, governments determining whether or not to tweak their welfare policies and so on. So I think there needed to be additional explanation as to how important that additional narrative was in deciding the allocation of welfare. So I believe that there is some benefits to expediency. I also believe that there's some harms in terms of access. I don't think either of those is proven sufficiently, nor were they weighed up against each other and like proven to be the more important thing in the debate. Finally, I want to deal with the authoritarian context, which I think is also a part of this debate. But I think the conclusion here is that there's not much difference on either side of the House, honestly speaking, as the affirmative side were able to prove that access to information is likely symmetric on either side of the House, especially in such a context. The negative side kind of attempts to prove that, it becomes easier to do these things because, they can refer to the feedback and be like, this race is bad. But again, there's a problem of not really mechanizing that enough. How important is that additional narrative in facilitating government oppression against minorities? I think that's something you have to prove in order for me to buy this point from the negative. So I don't think that weighed into the decision very significantly. There was a minor point on environment, but I don't think that was sufficiently impacted in the debate, especially because you don't really attempt to show what the marginal impact, the use of electricity would have on the environment overall. And you didn't really spend a lot of time explaining that. So in conclusion, I think the negative were able to take this debate on the principle, which I think was very important, and on the minority clash, which I think was also important, and was influenced by the negative victory in the first clash of the principle. So for those reasons, I think the negative took this debate. Thank you very much for what was an exciting round, and good luck in future rounds. Thank you.